All right, so we're diving into Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny.
Oh, yeah, this one.
This book. It seems like it's everywhere.
It is. It's very popular.
And I have to admit, I'm excited to really get into it.
Yeah.
We're going to be going through 20 lessons from 20th century history,
Okay.
but they're tailored for today.
Interesting.
So we're going to be looking at fascism, Nazism, and Soviet communism
All right.
to learn about modern threats to democracy.
Oh, okay.
So buckle up.
A little chilling.
It is going to be a little chilling, but,
Yeah,
knowledge is power, right?
that's true. One of the things that strikes me about this book is how relevant these lessons feel,
Yeah,
even though they're drawn from events that happened decades ago.
absolutely. And your goal today is to really try to understand Snyder's core message,
Okay.
especially how it applies to our lives right now.
Right.
So to get us started,
Yeah.
Snyder kicks off with something that, at least on the surface, seems simple,
Okay.
but is actually super unsettling. And he says, don't obey in advance. What's he getting at here?
I think he's talking about how authoritarianism often creeps in,
Yeah.
not through brute force,
Right.
but through a more subtle erosion of norms.
Okay.
And he argues that it's those seemingly small acts of obedience,
Yeah.
of going along with things because, they seem inevitable.
Right.
That's what paves the way for larger abuses of power down the line.
So it's like we're almost anticipating the need to obey,
Right.
even before it's explicitly demanded of us.
Exactly.
He uses the example of Austrians during the Nazi annexation, right?
Yes, that's right. A lot of Austrians at the time
Yeah.
cooperated with the Nazis in various ways.
Yeah.
And, they may have been thinking that they were just adjusting to a new reality.
Right.
But all those small acts of compliance,
Yeah.
they kind of sent a message
Yeah.
that the Nazis could actually push further,
Right.
that people weren't going to resist.
And of course, we all know
Yes.
the horrors that followed.
Yeah, it's a tragic example.
It is. And that kind of ties into what Snyder talked about with the Milgram experiment, right? This whole idea of how easily we can be manipulated into doing things
Yeah,
we never thought we were capable of.
absolutely. I think the Milgram experiment really drives home that point, that we humans are all susceptible to obeying authority,
Okay.
even when it clashes with our morals.
Wow.
I mean, the fact that most of those participants
Yeah.
were willing to keep administering
yeah.
what they thought were painful electric shocks
Right.
just because the experimenter told them to,
Just because they were told to.
it's disturbing.
It's really disturbing. So, I mean, how does this anticipatory obedience, I like that term,
Yeah,
how does that play out in our lives today?
right.
Are we any less susceptible to it?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, we might think we're more aware,
Okay.
more resistant to this kind of pressure.
Right.
But think about it. How often do we go along with things just because everyone else is? Or how often do we stay silent when we see something wrong just
Yeah.
because it's easier to look the other way?
Wow. Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
It's like that saying,
Yeah,
the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing.
exactly.
And Snyder's next lesson kind of builds on that idea
Okay.
of being proactive in defending what we believe in.
Right.
And he says we need to actively defend institutions.
Okay.
We can't just assume they'll always be there to protect us.
Right.
And he uses the example of German Jews who tragically
Yeah.
believed that Hitler wouldn't actually go as far as to dismantle those core institutions. Like,
Yeah.
he thought the system would safeguard them.
That's right. It's heartbreaking.
It is. What's interesting and frightening is that the Nazis didn't outright destroy institutions.
No.
Instead, they maintained this facade of normalcy
Right.
while systematically hollowing them out,
Yeah.
twisting them to serve their agenda.
It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah.
Right? Things look the same on the surface,
Right.
but the core values,
Yeah.
the integrity of the institution has been corrupted.
So thinking about that in the context of today's world,
Yeah.
are there any parallels that come to mind for you?
Well, consider, the debates around election integrity,
Yeah.
freedom of the press, judicial independence.
Right.
Are we seeing attempts to manipulate or undermine those institutions today?
Right.
And are we paying attention to these threats?
It's definitely something to consider.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on,
Right.
Snyder's next warning is to beware the one-party state.
Okay.
He's essentially saying that any democracy is vulnerable
Right.
if power becomes concentrated in the hands of a single party.
He uses examples like Nazi Germany and communist Czechoslovakia, to show how democracies can crumble after one party gains absolute control.
Right. And it's not always a dramatic takeover, right? Right. It's often this slow, insidious process. And Snyder calls it salami tactics, slicing away at the opposition bit by bit.
Right, until there's nothing left.
Wow. Okay, so how might salami tactics play out in a modern democracy?
Well, think about gerrymandering.
Yeah?
Where voting districts are manipulated to favor one party.
Okay.
Or voter suppression tactics that make it harder for certain groups to vote. Or even controlling the narrative in the media.
Right.
So people only hear one side of the story.
Okay.
These are all ways to chip away at the opposition.
Gotcha.
And consolidate power.
That's pretty chilling.
It is.
It makes you wonder, are there signs of these tactics being used in America today?
It's a good question.
And could the 2016 election, with all its polarization and upheaval, be seen as a turning point in that sense?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
It's a lot to think about.
Snyder actually compares the 2016 election to 1932 in Germany.
Wow.
The year before Hitler came to power.
Okay.
Of course, historical parallels are never perfect.
Right.
But it is definitely food for thought. You know? Are we seeing similar patterns emerge?
It really makes you think.
It does.
Snyder's next lesson: take responsibility for the face of the world.
Okay.
Kind of shifts gears a bit and focuses on the power of symbols.
All right.
What's he saying here?
Well, he's arguing that symbols, even those that seem insignificant at first glance, can actually have a profound impact on our thoughts and actions.
Okay.
They can be used to shape our perceptions, influence our emotions, and ultimately to control our behavior.
He uses some pretty disturbing examples.
Yes, he does.
Like those Soviet propaganda posters depicting prosperous farmers as greedy pigs.
Right.
Which ultimately helped pave the way for their extermination.
Yeah, and then also, you know, the marking of Jewish shops in Nazi Germany, which fueled envy and resentment towards Jews and contributed to the Holocaust. And these symbols weren't just random images. They were carefully chosen, strategically deployed to influence public opinion.
Create a climate of fear and hatred.
So how can we apply this lesson to our own lives? What should we be looking out for?
Well, I think it's about being aware of the messages we're constantly bombarded with. Whether it's through advertising, social media, or even the news. You know? Are we accepting certain narratives or stereotypes without questioning them?
That's a good point. I think we're all susceptible to this kind of influence. Especially in today's world. Where we're constantly inundated with information and imagery.
Absolutely.
So what's the antidote? How can we protect ourselves from this kind of manipulation?
Well, I think Snyder's advice is to be critical thinkers. You know, don't just passively absorb the messages you're exposed to. Question them, analyze them, consider the source.
I like that. And maybe it's also about being more mindful of the symbols we choose to surround ourselves with, right?
Yes.
The messages we choose to amplify.
Okay, let's move on to another important lesson. Remember professional ethics. This one really stood out to me. Snyder argues that even people with specialized knowledge and ethical codes can become complicit in authoritarian regimes.
Absolutely. He uses some very disturbing examples from Nazi Germany, like lawyers twisting the law to justify the regime's actions, doctors conducting horrible medical experiments, businessmen exploiting slave labor. I mean, these were professionals who, in theory, were bound by ethical codes. Yet they became cogs in the machinery of tyranny.
It's a sobering reminder.
It is.
That it's not enough to have good intentions. We also need to be aware of the larger context. And be willing to stand up for our principles. Even when it's difficult.
Especially when it's difficult.
What advice does he offer for navigating those situations where your professional ethics might be in conflict with what's being demanded of you?
He stresses that upholding our ethical principles is especially crucial during times of crisis or upheaval. You know, when the rules seem to be changing and fear is running high, it's very easy to convince ourselves that we're just following orders or that we're powerless to resist. But that can be a slippery slope towards complicity in truly horrific acts.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap? What concrete steps can we take?
Well, I think it starts with being aware of the potential pitfalls. We need to understand how easily our moral compass can be skewed.
Right.
Especially when we're under pressure or facing those difficult choices.
Yeah.
And we need to have the courage to speak up.
Okay.
To challenge authority and to refuse to participate in anything that violates our conscience.
Okay, now, for something I think will be particularly relevant to our listeners. Snyder's warning about paramilitaries.
Oh, yeah.
He seems to be saying that the presence of armed groups operating outside of state control is a major red flag.
Yeah. Lessons 6 and 7, be wary of paramilitaries and be reflective if you must be armed.
Okay.
Are incredibly timely, I think.
Yeah.
Snyder points out that paramilitary groups, by their very nature, erode democratic order.
He uses the example of the Nazi stormtroopers,
right,
who instilled fear and violence in German society,
yes,
and the SS, who ran the concentration camps, essentially operating with impunity.
Exactly. And he reminds us that one of the key characteristics of a healthy democracy is a clear distinction between legitimate state forces, like the police and military, who are accountable to the law, and the public.
Right.
And armed groups operating outside of that framework.
So what can we do to safeguard against the rise of these paramilitary groups?
Well, it starts with recognizing the danger they pose.
Okay.
We can't be complacent about the potential for violence to be used to intimidate and silence opposition or to undermine the rule of law.
And we need to hold our elected officials accountable for ensuring that law enforcement agencies are properly trained and supervised.
Absolutely.
And that they operate within the bounds of the law.
Yes, very important.
And I think we also need to be wary of the rhetoric that can delegitimize these state institutions.
That's right.
Create a climate of fear and distrust.
Exactly.
Which can make societies more vulnerable to the appeal of these kinds of groups.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to a lesson that's, I think, a bit more hopeful.
All right.
But still really powerful. And Snyder tells us to stand out. What's he saying here?
Well, he's emphasizing the power of individual action.
Okay.
Even when it feels like you're the only one. Even when it's uncomfortable or risky.
Right.
He talks about Winston Churchill defying Hitler when Britain stood alone against the Nazi onslaught.
Okay.
And Teresa Prekarowa, this young woman, who risked her life to help Jews escape the Warsaw Ghetto.
Right.
These individuals didn't wait for others to act. They saw what needed to be done.
Right.
And they did it, even when it seemed hopeless.
That's really inspiring.
It is.
It makes you think, what small act of defiance could I make that might inspire others?
Exactly.
It doesn't have to be something huge, right?
It doesn't.
It's not about being a hero.
No.
It's about having the courage to be different.
That's right.
To refuse to go along with the crowd when you know something is wrong.
Yeah, like speaking up when someone makes a prejudiced joke or refusing to participate in gossip or bullying or just simply being kind to someone who's being ostracized.
Yeah.
These might seem like small things, but they can have a ripple effect.
I love that. That even small acts of courage can create a ripple effect.
Because when we see someone else taking a stand, it can give us the courage to do the same. And that's how movements for change start.
Right.
With individuals who are willing to be different, to break the silence, to show the world that another way is possible.
Okay, let's delve into a lesson that's really fascinating.
Right.
Be kind to our language.
Interesting.
What's Snyder getting at here?
Well, he's exploring how authoritarian regimes use language to control thought.
Okay.
To shape our perceptions and to manipulate our emotions.
Right.
And he draws on the work of Victor Klemperer, who was a Jewish scholar who lived through Nazi Germany and kept a meticulous diary of how the Nazis distorted language to serve their aims.
It's almost like they were hijacking language itself, turning it into a weapon.
Exactly. Klemperer noticed how they would repeat certain phrases over and over, twist the meanings of words, even invent new words and expressions designed to normalize their ideology.
Gotcha.
Make it seem more acceptable.
Right.
And it worked.
Wow.
People started using these terms,
right,
even if they didn't fully agree with them. And over time, it became harder to think critically about the ideas they represented.
So how does this apply to our world today?
Right.
Do you see examples of this kind of linguistic manipulation happening now?
It's all around us.
Yeah.
I mean, think about how certain words or phrases are used to demonize opponents, to stir up fear and anger, or to shut down debate, or consider how certain groups are labeled with terms designed to dehumanize them and make it easier to justify mistreating them.
And Snyder ties this to the dominance of visual media, right?
Yes.
He's worried that we're becoming so accustomed to consuming information in these bite-sized chunks through images and sound bites that we're losing our ability to think deeply and critically about complex issues.
Absolutely. Constant screen time can actually narrow our vocabulary and make us more susceptible to this kind of manipulation. It's like we're losing the ability to think for ourselves, to deconstruct the messages we're bombarded with.
To discern truth from falsehood.
So what's the antidote? How can we be more kind to our language?
Well, he suggests, for one thing, we read more books, especially challenging books that force us to engage with complex ideas, grapple with different perspectives. He even recommends specific titles. Like 1984 and Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, which explore themes of tyranny, resistance, and the power of language.
I never thought of Harry Potter as a book about tyranny. But I can definitely see the connection now. It's about fighting against oppression, standing up for what's right, even when it's dangerous.
Exactly.
And it shows how language can be used both to control and to liberate, to manipulate and to inspire.
That's right.
I think that's ultimately what Snyder is getting at in this lesson. We need to be aware of the power of language.
Absolutely.
Use it wisely to defend truth, to promote understanding.
And to resist those who would use it to divide and control us.
That's a powerful message.
Okay, on to another crucial lesson. Believe in truth. Snyder argues that abandoning truth is the first step towards tyranny.
Absolutely. And it's so relevant to what we're seeing in the world today with the rise of misinformation, disinformation, and the erosion of trust in traditional sources of authority.
Snyder outlines 4 ways in which truth dies.
He does.
And it's chilling how relevant this feels to today's world. So let's break them down. The first is open hostility to verifiable reality. Basically, presenting lies as facts. Attacking anyone who dares to challenge them.
We saw a lot of that during the 2016 election with the proliferation of fake news and the blatant disregard for evidence. And it continues today with this constant stream of misinformation and propaganda that's circulating online.
It's like we've entered this post-truth era.
It does feel like that.
Where facts are no longer seen as objective or verifiable. But as something that can be manipulated, twisted to fit any narrative.
Exactly.
And the second way truth dies is through what Snyder calls shamanistic incantation, which sounds pretty intense. What does he mean by that?
Well, he's talking about the endless repetition of slogans and talking points, even if they have no basis in reality.
So it's about bypassing rational thought, appealing to emotion, using catchy phrases and sound bites to create a sense of certainty, even if it's based on falsehoods. Like those chants you hear at political rallies. It's about creating a shared reality, even if that reality is built on lies.
And when people hear the same things over and over, it can start to feel like truth, even if it's not.
Wow. Okay, so what's the third way truth dies?
He calls it magical thinking.
Okay.
And it's basically embracing contradictions. Without any attempt at logical consistency. He gives that absurd example of a farmer claiming that he can boil, poach, and hatch the same egg.
Wow.
Obviously, it's impossible. But it reflects a willingness to believe things that simply don't make sense. To abandon logic and reason in favor of wishful thinking.
I see what you mean. And that kind of ties into the fourth and final way truth dies, right? Misplaced faith. Blind devotion to a leader or a cause. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
Exactly. It's about believing what you want to believe, regardless of the facts, refusing to acknowledge any information that challenges your worldview.
So thinking about all of this, how do we as individuals combat these trends? How do we reclaim truth as a core value in a world where it's constantly being challenged and undermined?
It's not easy. It starts with being aware of the problem, understanding how truth can be manipulated and distorted.
Right.
And it requires a commitment to critical thinking.
Okay.
To questioning what we hear and see, seeking out reliable sources of information,
right,
and being willing to change our minds when presented with new evidence.
Okay, let's move on to 2 related lessons.
Right.
Investigate and make eye contact in small talk.
Okay.
They seem a little random together.
They do.
But I'm guessing Snyder sees a connection.
He does. He's arguing that we need to be active participants in the search for truth.
Right.
That we can't just passively consume information and assume that someone else is taking care of separating fact from fiction.
Right.
He urges us to support investigative journalism, to be curious, to ask questions, and to be willing to dig deeper to understand the issues that matter to us.
He even gives some very practical advice. Subscribe to reputable news sources.
Yes.
Learn about websites that debunk propaganda.
Right.
Be mindful of what you share online. And then there's that seemingly odd advice.
Yeah.
Make eye contact and small talk.
Yeah.
It might seem out of place.
It does.
But he's making a point about the importance of human connection.
Right.
And building community.
That's right.
In totalitarian regimes, people are often isolated.
Yeah.
Afraid to trust anyone outside their immediate circle.
And in a world where it's so easy to retreat into our own echo chambers, surround ourselves with people who agree with us, it's more important than ever to connect with people who are different from us.
Yeah.
To have those difficult conversations, build those bridges of understanding.
That's a good point. And when we get to know our neighbors, when we build those personal connections, we're less likely to fall prey to propaganda.
That's right.
More likely to stand up for each other when times get tough.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to a set of lessons that are all about active citizenship.
All right.
Snyder calls it practicing corporeal politics, which essentially means getting out of our chairs. Into the real world.
He's saying that online activism is important,
Yeah.
but it's not enough.
Right.
We need to be engaged in our communities, show up in person,
Right.
make our voices heard in tangible ways.
He uses the example of the solidarity movement in Poland,
Yes.
which brought together diverse groups of people
Yes.
through strikes, marches, and face-to-face interactions.
And he reminds us that being an active citizen
Yeah.
doesn't always have to involve those grand gestures or political protests.
It can be as simple as attending a town hall meeting,
Yes.
volunteering in our communities,
Right.
supporting local businesses.
Exactly.
He also stresses the importance of establishing a private life,
Okay.
protecting our privacy,
Yes.
especially in the digital age.
Right. He's concerned about the ways in which our personal data can be collected, used to manipulate us, track our movements, influence our opinions, control our behavior.
So what can we do to protect ourselves?
Yeah. He suggests being mindful of what we share online.
Okay.
Careful about the websites we visit, taking steps to secure our devices and accounts.
Okay.
He even recommends having important conversations in person, rather than relying solely on digital communication.
It's a good reminder that privacy is not just about keeping our personal lives secret.
Yeah.
It's about safeguarding our freedom,
Right.
autonomy.
Exactly. And it's about being aware of the ways in which technology can be used both to empower and to control us.
Okay, before we move on, I have to ask, what's been standing out to you so far? What's resonating with you the most?
Honestly, it's the sheer relevance of these lessons.
Yeah.
You know, they were written a few years ago, but they feel like they were ripped from today's headlines.
Right.
It's a reminder that the fight for freedom is an ongoing process.
It is.
And that we can't take our democratic institutions for granted.
I agree. It's definitely a wake-up call.
Yeah.
But it's also empowering to realize that there are things we can do.
Yeah.
Right. Even small things to make a difference.
Absolutely. That's what makes this book so valuable.
Right.
It's not just a warning about the dangers of tyranny.
Yeah.
It's also a call to action, a guidebook for how to resist those forces and protect our freedoms.
Absolutely.
It's interesting how Snyder says we should learn from other countries.
Yeah.
Especially those that have experienced authoritarianism firsthand.
Right.
In his lesson, Learn from Peers in Other Countries, he highlights how events in the U.S. are often reflections of global trends.
He talks about how Ukrainian journalists, having already dealt with Russian disinformation campaigns, were much more savvy in recognizing and countering similar tactics when they appeared in the U.S.
Right. It's like they had a playbook.
Yeah.
Americans didn't even know existed.
And he doesn't just focus on the negative.
No.
He also encourages us to, maintain friendships abroad.
Yes.
Travel, experience different cultures. To see how people in other democracies are tackling those similar challenges.
Absolutely.
He even suggests getting a passport.
Yeah.
Not as a means to escape, but as a tool to expand our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
And the different ways people are fighting for freedom.
It's about recognizing that we're not alone in this fight.
Right.
That there's a global community of people committed to democracy and human rights.
Okay, shifting gears a bit.
All right.
Snyder also offers some advice on how to recognize the danger signs when things start to go wrong.
Okay.
He tells us to listen for dangerous words. What are some of the red flags he points out?
Well, he highlights terms like extremism and terrorism, which are often used to silence dissent and justify those authoritarian measures.
So it's like those in power are trying to convince us that we need to give up our freedoms to be safe.
Exactly.
And he's particularly critical of the misuse of patriotic vocabulary.
Yes, he is.
What does he mean by that?
Well, he argues that true patriotism is not about blindly following a leader or accepting abuses of power in the name of national security.
Right. It's about holding our leaders accountable.
Yeah.
Making sure they're upholding those values our country was founded on.
Precisely. It's about having the courage to speak out against injustice, even when it's unpopular, even when it's risky.
So what happens when the unthinkable arrives? What advice does Snyder offer for staying calm and resisting panic in a crisis?
Well, he reminds us that modern tyranny